Okay, hi guys. This lesson we're learning about the elements of art. Now, there are 6 of them that I'm going to talk about. There are arguably a few more or less, depending on how you look at it. But let's begin by taking notes. So if you'll have a piece of paper and take notes with me, pause the video and go get some paper and a pen so you can take these notes while I talk. And if you take these notes in your sketchbook, then you'll be able to have your notes for the test because there's a lot of vocabulary terms involved here. So the first element of art, let's just write elements of art here. Elements of art. And the first one we will use is line. So I'm just going to make a little box here, and you can do the same. We're going to do some little drawings with the elements of art, but with line, what's the definition of line? Well, you all know what a line is, but it's the path, it's a path that a point makes as it moves. So a point makes as it moves through space, and space is another one that we'll get to, but that's a very important concept. Through space. And so you know what, we couldn't possibly make all of the kinds of marks here that line can do. Sometimes they get thinner or thicker. Sometimes, depending on what tool you're making, they could be wedge shaped, or different markers make that, or they could be squiggly, and they could be straight or curved, and so you get the idea with line. But it can actually be more important than you think, but we don't have time to dive into everything right now. It's just that line can suggest so many things, right? Scribbles, and you can shade with scribbles even. You get the point there. So we're going to move to the next one. The next one is shape. Now there are different kinds of shapes, right? But let's begin by talking about this shape and this shape. You know what to call this one. That is clearly a square, and we'll call that a squiggly. But now these are two-dimensional, so they're 2D, they're flat, and it's hard to create the illusion of 3D. So if I make another squiggly here and a square, it actually, to make it look three-dimensional, you have to create some illusions. So one of those would be like how you shade it. And so if I shaded this squiggly to look like it's got a shadow and it has highlights, I could shade it in different ways so that it looks three-dimensional. These 3D looking shapes, that's an illusion. They're not actually 3D, right? Unless they're popping off the page. This is called, when they're 3D, they're called form. So we have shape or form. Those are the elements that belong in this general idea. So here's a definition. The shape and form implies, that means it hints that there is spatial form. Again, we're dealing with that spatial thing. Form or the length, depth, width. It all has to do with space, just like we talked about line in space. Do you see a common theme here? Because we're going to get to space next, and everything deals with space. It's such an important concept. So space, we'll just give it a definition first before I draw. It refers to an area. So an area and how it's organized. So do you think about organizing your areas when you draw or paint and how it's organized. Do you organize your space? Do you represent volume? Again, length, depth, width, but volume of space and surface area, volume, surface, and I'm going to write depth here again because we're about to draw a picture just real quick that shows depth. Now this is down here where maybe I have a landscape. So you've all seen a horizon line like this where the sun could be setting out here, and a road could be going off in the distance. So it also refers to this idea that things could be getting smaller in space, but also if I had a bunch of maybe pyramids out in the desert, it deals with this idea of overlapping. So you could draw some little pyramids here, and they're overlapping. Because space does that. We have lots of overlapping, so I'm going to put depth and overlapping, even diminishing sizes. It becomes this thing becomes the most important idea if you can do these well as an artist to convince people of the reality of what you're representing. Okay, now I'm going to go to 3 more ideas that might be a little different from the shape and line and form and space that we've just been dealing with. But color can also help with space. Color is the next one. And these are, there's another word for color, and it's hues that come from 3 primary colors. You know that already from previous schooling. Hues that come from 3 other primary colors. So think about that. What are they? What are the primary colors? Red, blue, and yellow. And this is not a color lesson. We will have a color lesson and theory lesson in another assignment, but all of our other colors get mixed from that when we're mixing paints or inks and things like that. Now, your computer screen mixes colors in a different way, so that's different from these 3 primaries, but still we have basic colors that things come from. So, but then we also have black and white, and you're like, Mr. Kimball, are those colors or not? Well, what I want to introduce to you is that black and white do things to other colors. So they aren't considered a color necessarily, maybe the absence of color or the addition of light, because white is the addition of light and black is the subtraction of light. So black and white, if you have black, you can add black to a color, and we call it tinting. Shading a color. White is tinting a color, and black is shading. So I'm not actually going to draw all the colors out here, but you can do a value with shading. Remember value up above here? So when you're dealing with value, you're actually dealing with white and black as well. So texture. That's the next one. And there's no way I could draw all textures that exist for you, but we have some general ideas. Now, if you have a word for it, that's the best thing to do, because if you don't have a word for it, guess what you need to do? You need to discover it. If I have a texture that I can't put a word to, then I need to be able to describe it somehow. So I have a bunch of boxes here. And texture is I'll just give a definition. It's a tactile, that means how it feels. It's a tactile quality. All right, so a tactile quality, well, like you see a wood grain, the end grain of a piece of wood or a log that's been cut. Wood grain can also do, this kind of thing. Is it rough? Well, we have words for these. There's a knot in the wood. Is it soft? We could have like a furry something or other. And when we have lots of furry things, is it pokey? Is it sharp? Is it pointed? Or is it soft? We could do, the texture of a leaf, and it tends to be long and flowing, and more organic. So that's another idea, along with shapes. By the way, I forgot to tell you, these shapes, the squiggly is organic, and that's what we're dealing with texture too, organic. But then the square or the cube, that's geometric. So you need to know the difference. One thing that's not predictable is organic, and another thing that is geometric. Triangles and circles and squares, they are predictable. Triangles, they are predictable, and we have a word for them, but we don't have a word for these squiggly things. I've just made that word up, right? The closest thing I've heard. So the next thing in textures that I'm going to write or draw here is maybe that they're representational. There's two kinds of textures. If I'm generalizing, there's actual texture and there's implied. What does implied mean? It means that we are hinting that there's an illusion of something. So it could be shells, it could be all kinds of things. So you could draw some other pictures in there. It could be sandy, it could be a ball that is shiny and smooth, and there's a little highlight there. So there's so many ways that we could explain actual texture, how it actually feels, or implied texture, how it looks, even though it doesn't feel that way. And then there's the last one that I want to introduce to you today, and that is value. So value has a lot to do with color, because it's black and white shading or tinting of color. So value is basically relative lightness. Okay, I know that's silly. Relative lightness. I could say relative darkness though, right? So let's do that. Or darkness. And so this exercise I've given you in class, or I will give you, is to shade from light to dark and make a gradient. So a gradient, we don't have words for all of the grays that are between black and white. Gray is a shade or a value. So a shade or a value that gives us relative lightness or darkness, varying levels of contrast. So contrast is a big word. When I draw something and then I have a background, sometimes if my background is the same shade or gray as the thing in the foreground, if it's the same gray, then I lose the details. But if I have contrast, what I do is I have this thing in the background behind an object, and one of them can be gray, but then I have to keep the other one lighter or maybe darker. So I could take and make this darker. So this is contrast. This is contrast, and this is not. These are not contrasted very well. So these are the elements of art. In another lesson, I'm going to give you the principles of art, the way I see it, and you're going to use one element of art and one principle of art. Having said that, don't you think that you could do a drawing that would have lines and shapes and space and color and texture and value? Yeah. Actually, probably most of what you do will have, if not all of these, most of them. And you need to think about, Mr. Kimball, if I'm doing an assignment where I just use one, that doesn't mean that the other ones don't show up. It just means that you're doing one of these really well. So if you choose line, but you shade everything and there's no lines in it, that's probably not going to deal with lines too well. If you start doing different shapes and forms, but you don't add any color, you probably don't want to pick color. You need to just say, hey, Mr. Kimball, this is all about shape. If you're doing something with space and the illusion of space, don't tell me it's about texture if you'd mostly dealt with space. These are things you have to decide in your picture. Now, you're not done yet though. You need to pick an element, but then you also need to pick a principle of art to add to it, and it'll give you that in the next lesson.